Now, I'd like to thank Paul for suggesting we do this particular presentation. It was his suggestion. It's an excellent suggestion. Did a lot of research into it. And what we need to understand is why did the BLF, the New South Wales BLF, talk about and create, more importantly, talk about social unionism. Socially responsible unionism, they called it. What's the history behind it? Was there a political dimension, or was it just a reaction to the day? Well, I need to give a little bit of background history. The New South Wales BLF, Builders Labourers Federation, was created in 1911, and by 1968 it was basically a front for corruption and criminal activity being taken over by criminal gangs in Sydney. Now, at that particular point in time, the Communist Party of Australia, the CPA, had changed its tune as a result of the Czechoslovakian invasion that year in 1968. And the majority faction in the New South Wales Communist Party of Australia was what used to be called Euro-communist, which basically is communism with a human face. Now you've got to understand that individuals have impacts, but social reality also have impacts. Now, Jack Bundy was a member of the Communist Party of Australia. Bob Pringle was a member of the ALP, and Joe Owens, which made three of the main activists, was also a member of the Communist Party of Australia. So when the and they had about 100 members within the Builders Labourers Federation in New South Wales, which had about 11,000 members. So when they took up the leadership, they won the election and threw out the corrupt criminal elements in the BLF. They decided that they wanted to introduce a new type of unionism, which was based on direct democratic principles and which reached out to the local community. Because the philosophy was, the Antonio Gramsci form of communism was communism which was based on the concept of workers controlling the point of production. So we had this situation where they took over the leadership in 1968. Joe Pringle was only 28 and he was elected president. Jack Bundy was secretary. Now, everybody talks about the New South Wales BLF and the Green Band. I'll go into that later on. But what happened to the New South Wales BLF in terms of what they introduced into the union itself was quite extraordinary. And what was extraordinary that we had workers like concreters, scaffolders, dogmen. You all know what a dogman is. Yeah, good. Somebody who directs a crane, basically, used to stand on the iron and direct the crane. I used to be a junior dogman when I was a lad, and I used to be on the ground and direct the crane. But, so they had this disparate group of 11,000 people, which were basically very exploited in the building industry. The trade unions weren't interested in them because they're basically semi-skilled and unskilled. So what they were trying to do by introducing some political ideology into the union structure was actually not only change the structure but change the mentality by making it a more inclusive organisation. Because before 68 it was just run by a small handful of people who basically plundered the union for what it was worth. So they introduced some interesting concepts which have not been introduced to a significant degree since. They introduced the concept of limited tenure for officials. You can only be there for 3 years and then you can move on to another position. They introduced the concept of mass meetings of workers. Mass meetings to make decisions regarding policy. they introduced the concept of award wages for paid officials. So instead of them getting inflated fees, as we see in the trade union movement today, they got what was the award wage for the workers they were representing. At the same time, they're interested in making overtures to the community as a whole. And it wasn't until it took about 2 years to actually transform the union from this corrupt shell into this dynamic organisation where the membership were involved in the decision-making processes. Now, it was difficult, but it was also easy because there was over 100 members of the Communist Party of Australia, the Sydney branch, who were Euro-communists, who were also involved in the union, so they had some base from which to work from. So these are important things which we introduced. Internal democracy, limited tenure, wages for executives fixed to the award wage. At the same time, they began to pursue some very important industrial action. And in the first 2 years, most of their activity was revolved around improving the situation of builders' labourers. Now, I remember when I first came to Melbourne in 1971, you needed work. You stood at the corner of Johnson Street and Smith Street. There'd be about 40 young blokes and old men standing there, and a truck would roll up and they'd say, you. You jump in the back of the truck, do a day's work, you get a bit of cash in hand, and that's how builders' labourers were treated. So by creating this cohesive union based on direct democratic principles and involving the membership, involved them in strikes that improved their condition of the union members, they're actually able to gain the respect of the membership. And one of their first things that they agreed on was no ticket, no start. If you didn't have a ticket from the state branch of the New South Wales branch of the BLF, you were not able to work on a work site. You had to be a union member to work on a work site. The next struggle they were involved in is the struggle for workers' compensation. Believe it or not, there was no real workers' compensation for workers who were injured on the job at that particular point in time. Then there was the struggle for permanency, because building work is basically very impermanent, very part-time type of work. So they were struggling for permanency. They introduced safety as a primary concern for their members on the work site. And then what they introduced was the concept of workers' control on the job site, which meant workers actually made decisions about the productive process they just wanted to order about. So within between 68 and 1970, you saw the introduction of these ideas amongst the membership, so they're able to make it into a cohesive unit. Right? Now, although there are only 11,000 members, and they weren't tradespeople, they were critical to the construction industry. And if there was a no ticket, no job policy which you could enforce, it gave you an extraordinary amount of power at the point of production. The next thing they wanted to do was they wanted to increase their links with their local community. Remember, this is a very auspicious period. This is the period when the Whitlam Labor government was elected in 1972. So they had the ability to do things that you would not have been able to do under a Conservative government, because there's very little legislation which restricted workers from taking industrial action, doing flying pickets, doing secondary boycotts, all the things which are illegal today, and we'll speak about that later on. They're in a position to carry out, as long as they have a unified group. Now, a lot of people think that the first green bans occurred in Sydney. They didn't. The first green ban occurred in Carlton, believe it or not, where the Melbourne-based BLF, which was the federal executive, put a green ban on a park redevelopment in Carlton in 19... What's that? Gallagher Reserve, 1970. That was the first green. They weren't called green bands then, they were called black bands, right? Now you've got to remember that there was this constant competition between the federal executive in Melbourne and the branch in Sydney. The branch in Sydney was basically following Euro-communist tendencies. It wasn't authoritarian, it was a non-authoritarian branch. The branch in Melbourne was basically dominated by the Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninist, which is diametrically opposed to European communism because it was based on the idea of the authoritarian leader, which Naarm was. And basically, the executive and the leadership made the decisions. But I'll talk about that later on. So the first real test they had with the community occurred in about June 1971. And that particular dispute goes back, believe it or not, to 1892, where a gentleman with a little bit of money called Hussein Kelly bought some land on the North Shore to build a smelter. The smelter took up about 2 acres, and the rest of the land was basically an open park for the people of Sydney. In 1966, when the smelter was closed down, the whole Kelly's Bush area, that's what it was called, Kelly's Bush, the whole Kelly's Bush area was bought by A.V. Jennings, who were going to create luxurious apartments, you know, in that area, which meant razing down Kelly's Bush. Now, at this particular point in time, there was a woman, I don't know if she's still alive, I think called Betty James. And she was able to organise a few residents' meetings. And the local council, I think it's the Hunters Hill Council, the local councils called them 13 Bloody Housewives. That was their name. They formed Kelly's Bush Battlers. That was their name. And they went to the local government, they were pissed off. They went to the state government, the state government pissed them off. And so eventually, I don't know by which means, it'd be interesting, they actually approached the Builders Labourers Federation for some type of help. Now, the Builders Labourers Federation said, if you can show us you've got public support, we will stand behind you. They held a public meeting, over 600 people turned up. The New South Wales branch, and I'll keep saying the New South Wales branch of the BLF, because it's totally different to the Victorian branch. The New South Wales branch put a black band on the site. A.V. Jennings tried to bring in scab labour to actually work on the site, breaking the no ticket, no job, strategy which had been introduced by the New South Wales BLF. So the BLF said to them, if you touch one bush on this land, we will stop all A.V. Jennings projects which we're working on in Sydney. So there was a stalemate. So eventually, and this is many years later, 6 years later, what actually happened is the black band allowed the newly elected Rand Labor government to actually buy back the land from A.V. Jennings and create one of the last public parks in the North Shore, which you can enjoy today. And that was courtesy of the New South Wales BLF, because what we had a community group with no muscle, which had been totally ignored by the elected representatives, and a union-based group which had power at the point of production. Because they had a monopoly on the productive process and they were critical to building structures, they could actually use their combined power to stop development. Now, these were black bands. Now, the New South Wales BLF was not just about green bands, and I'll talk about that later on. In 1972, I think a company called IBL brought the houses in Redfern, which had been squatted and occupied by Aboriginal people. The New South Wales BLF put in consultation with the local Aboriginal people who have been evicted from their Redfern homes, which are going to be redeveloped and resold, put another black ban, the irony of it all, on development in that area of Redfern, and 65 properties. By that time, the Whitlam-led Labor government had been elected, and 65 properties were bought by the Commonwealth government and given over to an Aboriginal housing cooperative. Interestingly, Bob Pringle, who was the president of the New South Wales BLF, also became a member of that cooperative. The cooperative extended to medical centres, meeting rooms, as the government brought more and more, right? So people talk about, Aboriginal land rights. This is the first time in urban history that you've got rights have been acquired by an Aboriginal group. And Redfern exists today as an Aboriginal meeting place and housing cooperative because of the New South Wales BLF. Now, the New South Wales BLF was also involved in activities which went beyond just being a union. And you've got to remember, every black ban, every green ban on development means that the workers lose out on income, because if they're involved in that. So it's very difficult to get people who rely on a wage to survive to actually work against their own personal interests. But by this time, we had this organisation which was growing, which was reaching out to the middle classes in Sydney and reaching out to the National Heritage Trust, which people began to see as an important organisation which could assist them. And so what we saw is the introduction of a number of quite significant bans. In 1973, the New South Wales BLF, at that stage, I think Bob Pringle had become not Bob Pringle, Joe Owens had become the secretary. They introduced the term green ban. And that green ban covered three distinct areas. It covered an area of protecting open public space, and it became an area of protecting heritage property. And what happened is the National Trust in New South Wales had 1,900 sites on its books, and the New South Wales BLF voted to not work on any of those sites unless they had the permission of the National Trust. So what we see is this little organisation getting more and more influence and power in New South Wales. And what we saw was then move into the third phase, which in my opinion was their most important phase, where they started protecting communities from inappropriate developments. Places like the Rocks, which were low-income housing, places like Woolloomooloo, where 65% of the housing was public housing, which was going to be raised to build office blocks. And they placed green bans on those developments. But interestingly, they didn't do it independently. They would never move into an area unless there was a significant residents' action group. And they would take their direction from that action group, because there was no local support, there was no point putting in a green ban. Then they extended this, because they got this power at the point of production where they can actually stop things dead. What they did was they got the residents' action group to look at the development plans for the area and come up with their own development plans, a compromise plan. And if both parties were agreeable, they would lift the green ban. So what you saw, if you go to Sydney, is many of those little beautiful gentrified houses you see now had been saved for low-cost housing. So you've got all these. Then you had the bans, which I think affected Rozelle and Lightheart and Ultimo, about freeway extensions. Now these freeway extensions were going to bulldoze a lot of low-cost housing. They put bans on the freeway extension. And another interesting ban, you'll find this fascinating, is a ban they put on the Botanic Gardens, because they were going to build a tunnel under the Botanic Gardens, which was going to, believe it or not, interfere with the root structure of the Moreton Bay figs, right? So they put a ban on that. At the same time, they put a ban on the development of Centennial Park as a major sporting complex, because Sydney at that particular time had allocated parts of the Botanic Gardens and the Centennial Park as the site for the next Olympics in Australia, right? This was in the mid-70s. Now, they said, we're not doing any of that development. We're not putting any concrete in these parks. But we suggest you go to Homebush, because it's all empty area. And those of you who remember the 2000 Olympics will remember they were at Homebush. And everybody was particularly happy there. So what's happening is, there's this struggle. Now, the struggle also became involved with criminal elements, because they moved into... There were residents' action groups in King Cross, especially in Victoria Street, which didn't want to see the redevelopment of Victoria Street into, multi-storey apartments. And a number of criminal elements actually owned many of the homes. And so what happened is they terrorised the local residents, forced them out, most of them were renting, and on the 3rd of January, believe it or not, 1974, the police did the work for them and removed the squatters. And don't forget that on the 4th of July, 1975, Juanita Nielsen disappeared, murdered, we think. So they put a ban. So they were putting bans left, right and centre, but they weren't doing it for the sake of putting bans. They were working with community groups, residents' action groups, the National Trust, Botanic Gardens. They were working with people not because they're against development. They wanted more public housing. They wanted more public hospitals. They wanted more public infrastructure. They weren't interested in seeing the whole centre of Sydney being demolished and have high-rise office blocks. So by the end, now, their activities were not just related to green bans. People think it was just about green bans. And it's interesting that when the Greens Party was formed in, I think it was 1975-76, they will tell you that they took the name the Green Party as a result of the Green Ban name. So, and also the German Greens Party was also influenced. They came, I think her name was Petra, they came here to Sydney to see what was going on, and they took those ideas back to Sydney. So what we see is with this small organisation, 11,000 members, having a profound impact on developers, working on behalf of the community, as well as their own members, improving the situation for a large section of the population. At the same time, they were also involved in, obviously, anti-Vietnam activity, protest activity. You'll find this very hard to believe, but in 1973, they put a green ban on the University of Sydney until they introduced a women's studies course, the first women's studies course introduced in Australia, as a result of the BLF working with the emerging feminist movement, putting a ban on Sydney University. Then in 1973, a gay student living in accommodation at Macquarie University was evicted because he was gay. They placed a pink band on Macquarie University until he was reinstated into his accommodation. So they're looking at issues that affect the community: prisoners' rights, gay rights, Aboriginal rights, feminist rights. So they're not just involving themselves on workplace activities. They became a socially responsible union which worked in conjunction with their community through residents' action groups and other groups. Now, obviously, by the end of 74, you had $3 billion of development at stalled. That would be maybe $30 billion today because of the green bans. Now, they had got away with flying pickets, secondary boycotts, bans for a long time, because you've got the Whitlam-led Labor government which wasn't willing to intervene. So what happens? And now we see one of the darkest periods in Australian Union history. And I'll go into it in 1 minute, but I'd also like to maybe talk about 3 of the main characters before I look at the dark period. Now, Jack Mundy, as all good radicals, like myself, was born in Queensland. He was born in Malanda, which is 100 kilometres west of Cairns. His mother died when he was 4. He was sent to the Malanda Primary School and then a Jesuit college in Cairns, where his anti-authoritarian tendencies led him to leave school at 16. He drifted down the coast doing part-time work, eventually landed in Sydney at age 19, and guess what he did? He joined the Parramatta Rugby League Club as a player, and he played for Parramatta for 3 years. So he was a fit young bull. He then joined the Communist Party of Australia, the Eurocentric party, not the authoritarian Communist Party which we've seen in the past. He became involved in the building industry. He had an illustrious career till about 1974, late 74, and I'll go into that after. Now, Bob Pringle, he was quite interesting. He was, again, born in Queensland, born in Toowoomba, and he was a child victim of the Second World War in terms of his father was murdered at, I think it's Sandhurst, you could help me, Sandhurst prison camp where I think it was over 1,800 Australians were killed on a forced march. 3 survived to escape. So he didn't have a father when he came back. He went to school till he was about 15. He didn't get on with what was going on and eventually drifted down to Sydney, and at the age of 28 was elected president of the Builders Labourers Federation. He was not a member of the Communist Party of Australia. He was a member of the ALP. Then you have Joe Owens, who's an interesting character. He, I think he was born in 1935 in England. He drifted to New Zealand, where he did a fair bit of work and where he finally escaped because of his activities. Turned up at Sydney, where he was an illegal immigrant, and they said, piss off, go to North Queensland where you can get some work. So he went to North Queensland and gravitated south to Sydney. He was a member of the CPA, but I'll speak about their later life later on. So, end of 1974, you've got this powerful union at the point of production. You've got a residents' action group that says, we're not happy with this. We want to negotiate with the developers. We want a negotiated plan. The BLF says, fine, we'll put a green ban on that development until you've got a negotiated plan. $3 billion, and that's about 30 today, of building halted. Flying pickets, secondary boycotts, the list goes on and on. No ticket, no work, no start, okay? So what does the Master Builders Association of New South Wales do? They contact the Federal Executive in Melbourne. Now, the Federal Executive in Melbourne, as I said, is Communist Party of Australia, Marxist-Leninists. They describe themselves as Maoists, therefore they've got a strict authoritarian leadership where the leadership makes the decision. Now, the Master Builders Association, we think this is when money changed hands, but it's never been proven, came to an agreement with the Federal Executive in Melbourne, who were very jealous of what was happening in Sydney. Not because their enemies, the Eurocentric communists, were having some success in terms of recruiting people to their, workers' control platform. They thought this is a great opportunity for us to come in and take over. We're the Federal Executive, they're just a state branch. We believe they've gone too far with their green bans. It is halting development. So they got a number of carloads of thugs turned up at Sydney, occupied the offices, and then, this is the really interesting part, they introduced no start unless you had a federal ticket, right? You needed a federal ticket to work on the work site. Now you've got to remember that builders' labourers weren't paid very much, and they had to pay their rent, and they had to pay their mortgage, and they had to pay food, and they had to do whatever has to be done in order to survive. So they're faced in this quandary that if you haven't got a federal ticket, you can't go on a work site because the Master Builders Association has come in conjunction with the Builders Labourers Federation, the federal executive, and you can't get on a work site. So what eventually happened was that after a bit of confusion and conflict, the New South Wales BLF said to their members, you need to work, take out a federal ticket, because they were actually thinking of their membership. But what happened is the federal executive refused to give a federal ticket to any executive of the former New South Wales BLF. So they were on the outer. So they went to court, they won the case, but they were never allowed on a building site because of this alliance between the Masters Builders Association and the CPA Marxist-Leninist. Now, if you think, I was around in those days, and interestingly, in 1986, when Naarm was under a bit of pressure for receiving corrupt payments, and Mr. Hawke organised a royal commission, we saw the deregistration of the BLF. So, but the first thing they did when they took over is they rescinded many of the green bans. They refused to honour the green bans. They removed the internal democracy within that branch of the union. They removed limited tenure. They removed the idea of award wages. So basically, the union members were starved back into submission. Now, the other interesting thing, and I'll talk about the three people in a minute, but the other interesting thing about the New South Wales BLF is they weren't just interested in reform. They were interested in workers taking control of the work site, taking total control of the work site. At that particular time, they were working on the Sydney Opera House, and for a number of weeks, the Sydney Opera House was run on workers' control principles. And there's another place called Wyong Plaza. That, for a number of weeks, was run on workers' control principles because they believed that workers were capable of running these work sites. They didn't need bosses and outside authorities. So they actually put that into practice, which is interesting. Now, when we look at the story of the executive, look at Jack Mundy first. They were denied work in any capacity around Sydney and New South Wales, and obviously because they weren't rich because they got award wages for being executive members. Now, Jack Mundy was involved in a number of court cases. He actually sued the local, I can't remember, what's the local Murdoch press in no, that's Brisbane, Cory Mail's Brisbane.
Telegraph.
Yeah, the Telegraph. Sued them and won a defamation case. He threw himself into a lot of environmental work because he couldn't get a job. He was awarded a doctorate of letters and a doctorate of science by the University, I think it was of Western Sydney. He even got an AO at some stage in his thing. But he had a very tragic personal history. His first wife was Stephanie Lennon. She died of a brain tumour after the birth of their first child, and the child was only 15 months old. He was his only child, and he died in a car crash at the age of 22. So despite these personal tragedies that were impinging on his life at that particular point in time, he continued in this type of activity. Now, Joe Owens was interesting. He wasn't as flamboyant as Jack Mundy. Didn't have the publicity. Most people didn't even know who he was. But he was greatly respected in the New South Wales construction industry. And he became a fireman and joined the Federated Firemen's Union and worked with them for a number of years. He eventually retired and he died in 2012 down at not Nambucca, I think Nambucca Heads. And in June, I think it was the 12th of June, I could have the date wrong, 12th of June 2012, every crane on a Sydney construction site stopped for a minute to mark the passing of Joe Owens, because even then, years after the New South Wales branch of the BLF had been taken over, and years after the BLF was deregistered, he was considered amongst construction workers to be honest, as they used to say, his day is long. He could be trusted, he was honest. Now Joe Pringle, a gentleman from Toowoomba in Queensland, he had an interesting life, and unfortunately he died in 1996 because he was a keen fisherman and he drowned while fishing. So there's a lesson there for us. He was born in 41 and died in... And Jack, going back to Jack Mundy, he only died in 2020 at the age of 93. For many of his years he was living as on a houseboat in Sydney Harbour. He was involved in political activity right up almost to his death. He joined the Greens in 2003, stood as a Senate candidate, fourth position on the Greens ticket, just to help them along. Interestingly, in 1978, the Communist Party of Australia marked the New South Wales branch, nearly won a seat in the Legislative Council. They got 80,000 votes, about 2.8% of the vote at that particular point in time. So he became a respected elder and remarried. It was Judy Wilcox, who became president of the Communist Party of Australia, in the National Communist Party of Australia. So, what are the lessons? Well, they're very simple. Unions should be part of the community, and the community should be part of the union movement. And that's what they did. And they did it consciously, not accidentally. This was a conscious entry into the union movement. Now, many other unions have been taken over by sections of the Communist Party, sections of right-wing organisations, but they weren't taken over in terms of using their muscle to improve the situation of the community as a whole. They were taken over just to, one, for influence, possibly to assist their members get better paying conditions. And what we've seen since those heydays, we've seen legislation after legislation after legislation go through Parliament since 1974, which means every tactic that was used by the New South Wales BLF, and to a lesser extent the Victorian-based BLF, which did place green bans on Flinders Street Station, green ban on the site of the Eureka flag in Ballarat, green ban on the Regent Theatre, as I said, green ban on that park. But the trouble was, they didn't. They were not interested in any rank and file activity. I had an acquaintance at that particular point in time who then became a member of the executive of the CFMEU, John Lowe, and they were trying to organise a rank and file group within the Melbourne branch of the BLF, and he found himself at the end of a board high up in the building, and he was threatened that if they didn't stop organising, and these were anarchist elements based around Dingo and the Collingwood 3 store in 1971 in Smith Street, that they would meet an untimely end and it looked like an accident. So they didn't, there was no interest in the membership as a whole. So I'm not saying everything the federal branch did was bad, but their intervention lost the credibility amongst many, not just radical elements, but amongst a lot of community groups in the country. So, legislation. It's illegal to hold a strike outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period. It's illegal to do a secondary boycott. It's illegal to go onto a work site unless you're invited by the employer in the majority of cases. At one stage it was illegal to fly the Eureka flag. It's illegal to have a flying picket. It's illegal to picket. That's why you need community pickets. You know, an individual, and this is the beauty of it. An individual worker can be fined $10,000 a day for being involved in unauthorised industrial action, and it did occur in West Australia about 20 years ago. Now you can imagine, faced with the prospect of a $10,000 fine, you're going to think twice about stepping outside. So what we've seen recently is the CFMEU forgot the lessons of the New South Wales BLF. When we were involved in the struggle to stay the Barrick Beacon estate, which is a public housing estate in Port Melbourne, which has been demolished, and now we're getting a community and private, so-called community housing private partnership and no public housing. We approached the BLF before they were actually, what's the word? No, investigator, whatever. Administration, for assistance, and they were not interested. So they lost their capacity to interact with the community. They're more interested, obviously, in looking after the interests of their members, but they forgot that isolates you as a union. The best way for unions to survive is then to become involved in community action. But most of those avenues have now been legislated out of existence. And the beauty is, it's not about jailing people in executive position. It's not about bankrupting unions. It's about targeting individual members. So when people complain about what's happening in China or Russia or Outer Mongolia or about workers not having any rights, you should actually highlight how few rights workers have in this country. Very few rights. If you can't withdraw your labour, you're basically a slave. That's all you are. Questions? Comments? Anybody involved in union struggles? You're all dumbstruck.
Well, I had a friend, and she had a boyfriend, and he was with the Norm Gallagher mob, and she knows that she went up to Sydney with a gun.
Yeah. It was a forceful, physical takeover.
Yeah.
Guns, cricket bats, the whole works.
Yeah, and I might have been international socialists at the time. All of a sudden they switched their support from Jack Bundy, and I couldn't understand, and the line was, oh, they've had their time, they're over. So there was no argument, no logical explanation.
No.
It was just a switch, a mindless switch.
I agree with you, because my dad was hanging docker, and you don't have had it, but beautifully hanging dockers about some of the work. All of them. They're very good on the street, and they just work hard for their families. They got rebuilt by the government and people in power. That was it.
Well, the trouble is, if you've got a closed shop and you've got no interaction with the community,
Yeah.
smaller unions can be easily taken over by criminal elements.
Yeah, true.
And then it's easy. And then what happens is people say, oh, look, I don't want to get involved in anything because there may be physical consequences for me and more importantly, my children. And as you said, they did go up with guns, and it was all kind of authorised by the state government, New South Wales state government. It was authorised by the Master Builders Association. It was an unholy alliance, which you wouldn't expect.
The painters and doctors, well, one thing that came out of that is they named not that they named it, but a band called Painters Dockers, which is one of the best bands in Australia, came from there.
Do you want to hear the story?
And they're fantastic.
Do you want to hear the story? Well, they picked out the name Painters and Dockers, right? They didn't realise that there was a real Painters and Dockers. So what happened is they organised for the Painters and Dockers to come and have a listen at their gig, right? It's a true story. You know that story, don't you? Yeah. Yep. And they said, yep, they're all right. They can be called the Painters and Dockers. Yeah. True story.
One of their songs was Die Up We Die.
Is it correct imagination for painters and doctors?
See, my father, when he came here, his first job, he was a lumper. And if you go into the Waterside Workers Unit, 46 Island Street, I don't know if it's been pinched, there used to be a banner for the Lumpers Union. You know what a lumper was?
No.
A human conveyor belt. You'd walk up to the ship, they put 100, whatever, 50 kilos on your shoulder, you'd walk, 100 metres, you'd drop it somewhere else, and somebody would load onto the truck. So there was a whole union. Obviously that's no longer exists, but it's interesting. Any more questions?
I've got some comment. Is that when I first came to Australia, I was involved in Defend the Unions Committee, which was when they essentially it was the attacks on the BLF here in Melbourne, and that was. I mean, there was lots of fighting and carrying, not physical fighting, but lots of debates and stuff and divisions and whatever. But it was actually quite a fantastic time where a union like the BLF actually was in a way forced, those are my words, to recognise the contribution of the community in their struggle. And I can remember standing on the cops were moving in to there was a suspected that the cops were going to beat up the unionists, and there was a call out for community members and me, who I'm 5'2" and a bit, and me and this nun stand like this. This nun was no bigger than me, and between the cops and some of these big BLF bruisers. But there was a really good camaraderie. And also, when I was working at the State Library, we had a strike at this, of library staff, and it was a time when the CFMEU were on site. It was a CFMEU site. And they were renovating the library, and we went to, and it was John Zepka then, who was not the John Zepka that I know now. He was, and we went to see him, and he knew us from our involvement in the Defend the Unions Committee, and went to him and told him, look, we're putting up a picket line, we want to stop people going in for Fashion Week. It was a big deal. And I said, we need your workers not to cross our picket line. And he organised it so that those who wanted to could join our picket line as individuals, not as an official, because it wasn't allowed. And those that didn't were moved somewhere else. And there was quite a number of those CFMEU workers came and stood by us on the picket line.
Because what you've got to remember is that many of the workers involved in the New South Wales BLF and their sympathisers in Victoria and Tasmania, and to a lesser degree Queensland, joined the Gallagher mob because there's no other option.
Yeah.
So they're actually able to dilute that innate authoritarianism which came from the Marxist-Leninist component of the leadership in the BLF. And also, as you said, pickets weren't allowed by that time. Secondary boycotts had been banned, and so they had to rely on community pickets.
It was, so there was some good times. Things that we did occupying places you couldn't do now. You get.
Well, if you occupy a workplace, you can actually be jailed for up to 25 years, which is the legislation which was passed after 9/11. It doesn't mean you're going to be jailed, but you can be jailed if you're a recidivist. So people, if you were here in the 70s, there were rank and file groups in the Metal Workers Union, which I was involved with. There were rank and file groups in most unions. And these rank and file groups actually had more power than the executive, and they made decisions, and you saw the occupations. You saw at Holden, you saw the occupation at Broadmeadows in the 70s, and how extensive those occupations were. And occupations were a legitimate workplace tactic, which didn't result in any legal consequences unless you damaged equipment.
The other thing I wanted to say was that I've got a book at home and I should have brought it. It's just a thin book about like that, and it was done by Joan Coxage, who was an ALP member of Parliament, and I don't think she was in the Commons School.
She would have been an issue, yeah.
Yeah, and Joan was a friend of mine too, and she was also a beautiful artist, and she did all the drawings of all the main buildings in Melbourne that the BLF had saved from people. Yeah, I really should have.
See, the tragedy is if you go around Sydney and you go around Melbourne, there are no little plaques saying the Regent Theatre was saved by a BLF Green Band, Flinders Street Station was saved by a BLF band. You just don't. It's as if the reason I was pleased that Paul asked me to talk about this tonight was it's a forgotten history, but it's a very important part of union history, and more importantly, it's a very important part of demonstrating to people that unions, which now only 12% of the population, working population, are members of, are not distinct entities from the community at large. The community at large needs people who have an impact on the point of production to work with them to create a better society. So that's what they call themselves, unions for socially responsible unions. They understood that their members were members of the community. Their members needed low-cost housing. And although they put a green ban on the destruction of that, it not only assisted the community, but it also assisted their members. They understood that.
Yeah, look, I got a couple of things. Like I listened to a couple of podcasts on this topic in the last year or so, and one of them kind of talks, whereas you were talking about basically entryism, they're taking over the shell of a union. The way it was kind of framed in that was more that, it was a sign of the times. You've had the Vietnam period, you've got all these young builders, labourers coming on who've been politicised. They also talked, as much as they mentioned the split between the federal and the state, but also the role of the boom and the bust period. There was enormous space to do a lot of this action because there was a liberal, very right-wing government in power who were open slather for development. So interested if you have anything to say on how those things interplay or your thoughts on it, or anyone else's who might know more about it as well.
Well, look, they were open for development. That was the whole point.
Yeah.
You raise the old. If you go down St Kilda Road,
Yeah.
you'll see occasionally an old mansion, and the rest is development started in the 60s. It was the same there. The Rocks, Woolloomooloo, Glebe, Lightheart, King's Cross, inner city areas, public housing, low-cost housing, people with no political muscle, easy to knock them down, build these huge multi-storey units, and that's what it was about.
Yeah, look, I guess I was alluding to something like, I don't know when the boom started to dissipate, but I also, from my basic understanding is that it played a significant role. If there's not massive development being pushed by Conservatives, they haven't got as much work. People are going to be laid off. You've got a boom and a bust cycle. Did it play a role, or was the boom continuing on for several years? I don't know this period. It's well before my time.
Well, what the New South Wales BLF is, they put a lid on the boom, and that's why they were basically shut down at the end of '74. You had 42 green bands mainly in the Sydney area. You had $3 billion of production, which was held up. But the important thing is the way the union was structured and the way they looked after their membership. Their membership were not short of work, and obviously because it's a boom period, and although there was all these bans, they got away with the bans. That's all I can think of.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's related to economic boom and bust. It's related to the ability of you being able to provide work for your membership. You're not convinced of that?
No, not entirely. No, I'm not.
No. Yeah, I
thinking
mean,
about
you're
it.
looking at
If
cycles.
this had been a bust period between 1968 and 1975, say, I'm not convinced they could have got up and running, that there would have been enough work and that they could have done the action that they could have perhaps. Look, and it's purely hypothetical, but I'm thinking in terms of what my family went through. There was a bust in the 80s, and my dad was a plumber and gas fitter, and the industry fell flat. He had to go out and work for himself rather than the big company he'd been there for 20 years. Made it very, very hard to organise, you know, because I'm only a kid at the time, so I can't give you great insight. But, could they have really got it going, you know, if there was an economic downturn?
Well, I think they could have got it going because you had a sympathetic Labor government in power federally. That's the key. You've got 72 to 75, the Whitlam Labor government, which was about redistributing wealth.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you've got the New South Wales BLF at their height. You know, they took a few years to consolidate, and at their height, you had government work like the Sydney Opera House.
Yeah.
You had development. You know, it is much more difficult in a bus cycle, but I think they had the political nous and the experience to actually ensure their members continue to get work. Now, I know you're saying if there was no boom, they wouldn't have been able to get work and the whole thing would have collapsed much earlier. You could be right. But what we deal with is not if, but the reality of the time.
Yeah, look, I'm
And
just...
it's much easier, I agree,
Sorry.
it's much easier in a boom period to organise. Used to be, not anymore, but it used to be.
Yeah, look, I'm just thinking of it, like I'm a teachers unionist, so we're potentially heading into industrial action in the public sector. The state government, although they can always find money for the military and whatever, they've got money if we push them hard enough. But amongst the members, there's a lot of talk, the government's broke, you know, they've spent too much. They, you know, owe us hundreds of millions of dollars in funding. You know, people are, there was a report in the paper the other day, buying all the stationery for their classes and programs are getting cut. We're losing all our tutors and things like that the next little while. So in terms of, you know, how much leverage we're going to have and what we're actually going to be able to gain, there's, you know, an argument that there's not much in the pool. I'd hope that we overcome that and they'll find the money if we push them hard enough. Don't have a lot of faith in the Victorian leadership. They're new. They may be more progressive than the last batch. And there's a lot of anger amongst the teaching staff because we're in chronic shortage. But I just wonder when we're really not, we've got a lot of leverage because there's a shortage, but maybe there's not enough money in the purse for us to really grab a big handful of. We'll see what happens, you know.
Well, maybe if you're a health worker, it'd be a lot easier. Remember the nurses' strike in the 1980s?
Yeah.
It really depends on your power point of production.
Yeah.
Now, COVID taught us we don't need schools.
Yeah. Well,
We
we were
need
still
teachers.
teaching. We were just
We
doing
need-
it through a computer. Yeah.
So maybe you're right. But and again, you've got to work within strict parameters. Enterprise bargaining agreement.
Yeah, that's
periods.
right.
You're renegotiating for another 4 years?
Yeah. And look, there is rank and file groups, but they're largely Trotskyist dominated.
Yeah.
There's some good interventions. We really have, I think, pushed them forward to potentially ballot for strike action in the next, I think it'll be an announcement within the first week of term going back. I think it's on the cards. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, you know.
You've got an election around the corner.
Yeah, so we have got some squeeze. And the independent teachers are also bargaining around the same period. They've just managed to get the 300 different employers for a big part of their sector to go under a, I don't know what to call it, a group agreement, you know.
Because what they'd
So
like to do,
we'll see.
the state government would like to put all of this to bed a few months before the election. They want to look hard
Yeah,
against you at the minute,
yeah.
but they will settle just before the election, especially if the polls
Yeah.
until they like
I
it.
just hope we get a decent deal. You know, New South Wales are making $10,000 more just across the border in their first year, let alone a whole heap of other, you know, conditions that we don't have. And
Wow.
Queensland, similarly, we've got the lowest paid teachers, worst conditions in the country.
Queensland.
People are burning out. You know, I've only been in the gig for 7 years now, I think, and I'm nearly done. You know, some days I'm just like,
Are you
I can't
permanent
go
or
back.
part-time?
Permanent, ongoing, which everyone's pretty much got because it is a teacher's shortage. A lot of people have got that, but the burnout rate's insane. Anyway, I'm having a whinge about my particular hobby horse. I don't think we're getting off track here.
No, good point. So can I add, this is on different subject. There's a bridge in Flinders Street. Elizabeth Street goes across the Yarra, right? Now, from there, if you look towards the horizon, you can barely see it now. It's all been covered in buildings, so there's plenty of development, but stuffed housing. That's the point I want to make. So if you look down towards the, like the horizon, it's virtually almost gone. It's all buildings, all from Spencer Street.
Yeah.
Any other comments? The New South Wales BLF?
And I was going to say that we should at some point watch Rocking the Foundations. I don't know, you know, which is the film about Jack Munday.
And he did his autobiography. It's not very good, but it's readable. 1981, he wrote his own autobiography. But I mean, he, as I said, he joined the Greens 2003. He was involved in activity in 2009 to stop freeway development, and that means he would have been born in 29, so he would have been an old man. And as I said, he had a tragic personal life through no fault of his own, but he went through it. If there's no more questions, I'll be interested in a topic. There'll be no talk in February because I will not be in the country. But anybody got any ideas for a historical topic for March? Otherwise, I'll have to pick one from the ether. Look at you all thinking. Come on, Australian history. Yeah.
Well, I know you're going to do commercial in confidence, but don't do that in February or March, please, because
Done.
won't be around.
All right.
Universal income.
No,
That's
no.
excuse me. Excuse me. I'm not going to do it because it's not historical. All right, you can relax.
So I'll keep bringing it up.
Great thing. He doesn't believe it.
Oh no, fair enough.
He wants to be a wage slave.
I
for the rest of
believe
his
in
life.
workers
Yeah.
struggle to win
Come on,
my
a historical period you're interested in. And I mean, if you go to josephtoscano.com, I've got about 25, 30 historical.
Waterside Workers Federation in Fremantle before and during the war.
I want the whole of Australia
Oh, all right.
because they put bans against the Indonesian government regarding West Papua. They put bans on sending steel to Japan in '38. And this goes. So the Waterside Workers Federation. That's what you're interested in?
Yeah, in the 30s and the 40s.
All right. Well, we'll go from the beginning of the Waterside Workers Federation until the beginning of World War II, or at the end of World War II, which is what we do.
But I don't know about the next one. Not February.
No, there'll be nothing next month because I'm not here.
I've got one for another time.
Yes.
The free speech movement in Sydney Road, Brunswick, where Noel Counihan locked himself in a cage and spoke out against
Yeah,
fascism.
well, how about the free speech movement in the whole of Australia, including the Bielke-Peterson ban
Well,
protest?
why not?
How about the free speech movement during the convict era, where people were, lashed 500 times for opening their mouth? So I'm happy to look at free speech and the lack of constitutional protections in Australia. But as I keep saying, I'm fascinated by the number of radical activists who come from
I was born in Queensland.
There you go, there's another one. Yeah.
Mackay.
Good on you.
Yeah.
Further north, the better. You know you had the only communist member of state parliament in the 20s and 30s?
No, that's brilliant. I didn't
Yeah,
know
what was
that.
his name?
Oh, I can't remember now, but
He was elected on a number of occasions because at that stage you had mainly itinerant workers up there, people in the cane fields,
Yeah.
you know, no itinerant workers, working on stations.
So what I don't understand is like Queensland's got quite an oval history when you think about the shearers and so on. But when I went there a couple of years ago, just travelling up and down, it was so right wing. It was.
But it's changed. See, what happened is social movements, political movements are created by the social conditions they find themselves in. Now, in the 1920s, Queensland was the most radical state in Australia. They had government-owned butcher shops, government-owned food shops, it went on. But the issue then was Queensland was mainly made up of itinerant workers. So they didn't have any real estate to protect. They moved from station to station, cane field to cane field. So what's happened now is all those itinerant workers have disappeared. And you've got an influx of you southerners who've polluted us.
I'm not a southerner. I'm not a southerner.
No, seriously, there's been a huge influx of people from Victoria, New South Wales, bringing their crappy ideas to
You
Queensland.
can say that about Victorians, I'm not Victorian.
It's even worse. No, seriously, the conditions have changed. You haven't got mainly male itinerant workers. You know, what you've got is now communities which are, imbued with a racist sentiment, who somehow think that the rest of Australia is out to get them, that we think they're stupid, and this is the reaction. And this is why the Divided Nation crew has been so successful, because what they've done is what we haven't been able to do. They've recruited the poor, the disillusionised, the marginalised, and the ostracised. They have recruited them on a hate bandwagon.
well, they haven't even recruited trans and gender diverse people.
Yeah, well, you're 1% of the population, mate. They don't care about you. They're using you as a hate figure. You know, you're the demons. But if you talk to people in Queensland one-to-one, it's not as bad as you think. The other thing you've got to remember is Queensland is and I know people don't read newspapers, is a one-party, one newspaper town.
Yeah, it is.
And the Courier Mail has corrupted minds in Queensland for over 70 years. There has been no opposition. And I know people think the legacy media is irrelevant. But the trouble is that the legacy media is still very relevant because it sets the agenda for the day. Where does social media pick up its information regarding local issues? The legacy media. Where does radio pick it up? Legacy media. Television. So one day, this is the issue. Next day, this is the issue. Look at the newspapers and you'll find that's what they've written about.
Thank you. I don't mind that analysis.
Yeah, and they're still very powerful. And if you, I grew up, I was there. I was evicted from Queensland in 1976. After I finished my medical degree and I did my internship, I was told not to bother applying for any hospital jobs in Queensland. That's why I came to Melbourne. And then I was banned in Melbourne in 1986. So, you know. But it's interesting because you've got this
one paper town too.
Sorry?
Adelaide is the one paper town.
Yeah. Is it a Murdoch paper?
Yeah, of course. Who else would it be?
Well, you've got West Australia. It's not.
Yeah, but that's just as bad. That's Seven West Media. They're just as right-wing fascist. Who support Ben Roberts-Smith. Funded him. Gave him a special job in Queensland.
You're just jealous, Paul.
Yeah.
He'd like to be a VC winner, I know.
Yeah.
So anyway, where's the unions now? Are they sitting on the...
Well, they're at the CS. The only powerful union left outside the public service unions, you've got around 12% of workers are in trade unions. 12%. That's what, one in nine. Most of them are in public service jobs, like teaching, because it's much easier to organise. Individual contracts is the name of the game. Legislation has been passed to ensure that continues to occur. Even the new unions that are springing up, like Beavers,
Oh, there's RAF.
union. It's very hard.
Fast food.
It's very hard to recruit. One, because people can't afford the membership fee, but two, they're frightened that they're going to lose their job. In the majority of cases, they would. So we're back to the 1880s and 1890s.
That's the climate they cause, don't they? The fear in the community to get involved, isn't it?
Well, I think part of the problem is that if there is a win by the union, the non-members get that win anyway. So they see, what's the point in paying all the dues if I'm just going to win anyway? And they don't have to struggle for it, you know?
You know, in 1911, the new Commonwealth Labor government passed legislation that you couldn't do a public service job unless you were a union member.
Yeah.
That was the Labor Party at that particular point in time, which actually had a radical trajectory. So you had to be a union member to be a public servant. Now, and see, they make all little things like dues are not collected by the bosses, are they?
But
They have to be collected
No,
by
not by the bosses, no.
No, they have to be
by the
collected.
union. But they should be, I think the BLF, getting award wages for executives is definitely where it should be. Some of the salaries that the exec are getting are just outrageous, you know.
Well,
Yeah, and they're on permanent tenure. Look, I wonder if in this day and age, if the union movement in the public sector was to try and somehow focus around those two demands, that they might actually be possible, maybe.
Yeah.
You know, that ongoing tenure, like life on I don't know how much they make, fuckloads. Absolutely ridiculous. You know, no accountability or.
yeah.
You know, they're still nominally on the books, connected to a school. Might have been 20 years, you know, they've got this weird thing that, you know, they might, they could do a day, but they never do.
Well, it's
You
a
know?
career pathway to a state job or a federal job as a parliamentarian.
Yeah.
So
And
what
they're
you've
just
got is
all ALP hacks.
you've got career bureaucrats.
Yeah.
You've got the trots down the bottom
Yep.
trying to eat away,
Mhm.
and then you've got the ALP bureaucrats at the top.
Yeah.
I mean, I think as social conditions change, there may be a resurgence in unionism despite the legislation. It means going back to the Clary O'Shea days where he was jailed, you know, for taking industrial action. It was, I think it was 69 or 68. I mean,
So you don't think it's possible to pull back some of that legislation that they've introduced, some way to
well, there is, and that depends on whether you're actually able to influence the Labor Party, which is very difficult.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the legislation which was passed, I think it was today or yesterday, regarding hate speech. Now, people haven't looked at the details. It's very interesting. Hate speech is defined as causing economic, psychological, or social harm. And it includes irony and satire. ASIO is the instrumentality which determines which organisation needs to be banned. That's in the legislation. So, and then you see the minister, who was I think the Attorney General, saying that if you say things like that Israel is guilty of genocide, that can cause harm in the community, and that is covered in that legislation. I don't think it's practical, but it's interesting that they've passed this. It's not about hate, it's not about violence, it's about economic, social, psychological harm.
I heard that, and admittedly it's a social media post, but relatively trustworthy, that people were getting their doors kicked down this morning on the left. for supposed, I'm shooting outside of the hate speech stuff around criticisms of Zionism, Palestinian left, pro-Palestinian left. I heard that doors were getting kicked in this morning.
I don't
So
know.
it's passed yesterday and there's already door kicking going on. I don't know exactly, other than, it's people that I know from online that I trust. That this was happening and people were like getting rid of documents and whatnot this morning. So it's already, it's only been less than 24 hours and allegedly that's happening. I can't confirm it, but I'm pretty sure it actually is happening this morning.
So you're suggesting that it needs to just be direct action that is the way to change the current situation with the This Week unions. Basically, people getting arrested,
That's
and that's what is.
The trouble
that
is,
the way forward.
they don't even give you that honour of martyrdom because they try to bankrupt you first. That's the problem with the legislation. Everything you've worked for can disappear in a few weeks. But if you got union executive members, which you don't, who'd be willing to push the envelope, then maybe you could create some type of sympathy. But if unions are, what the New South
That's
Wales
why
did-
people aren't members. I think that's part because they just see, for example, during COVID, the teachers' union were so close to, they had a lot of buy-in from families. People could see, what teachers were doing, and there was an enterprise agreement being negotiated at that point. And then they just did a deal and, didn't go the extra, didn't hold off. And
Told people to vote for it because, and it was shithouse.
Yeah.
And we're thousands of dollars backwards from there because they fudged what was going to happen with
Well,
inflation.
if they're all top heavy in the ALP, what do you expect? They're going to
Yeah, I know.
What are the elections like? Are they contested or the positions are?
There's a little bit of contesting. Yeah, look, there's there is a rank and file type group. It's largely Trotskyist space. Some of them have middle level positions, as you were kind of outlining. That's how it works. And they managed to garner about a third of the votes. And maybe next round, because their hard work is being recognised, despite my slight political differences, they may get closer to that line. So it could be an interesting union election in a couple of years' time.